Chapter 3: The Roof. Mamoru's eyes were fixed on his knees, but he could feel the headmaster's gaze boring into him. Kwang was kneeling on the tatami of the office beside him, a cloth pressed to his face to stem the blood pouring from his nose. The blow hadn't broken anything. Mamoru had better control than that, but the northern boy would be bleeding for a while. Kwang Chul-hee is new here, the headmaster said, setting his brush pen aside to fold his hands on the desk before him. It's possible that he was not taught any better at his previous school, but Mamoru, you know that this is not how the warriors of Takayubi settle their differences. Mamoru's fists clenched on his knees, the knuckles of his right hand still stinging as his insides curled up in shame. "I'm very sorry, sir," he said at his knees. "I'm sorry that you were not able to set a better example for our new transfer student," the headmaster said, and the hard disapproval in his voice was more than Mamoru could bear. "You're talented, Mamoru, but talent is meaningless without self-discipline. You will never be a fully realized Matsuda if you continuously let your pride run away with your principles." Choked with shame, Mamoru could only nod. And Kwang Chul-hee, the headmaster, turned to the bleeding boy. "I want to make it clear that this sort of behavior is not tolerated in this school or this village. The sons of common peasants may come to blows in schoolyard brawls, but not warriors. We settle our differences in single combat. The next time you and Mamoru have a quarrel, you will take it to the fighting circle, or you will keep it to yourselves. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Kwang mumbled as best he could with blood still running from his nose. "As punishment, you will both stay after school and clean the entire roof, without the use of your powers." Mamoru's heart sank. The chore wasn't insurmountably difficult, he just didn't want to do it with Kwang. "You may use ice to anchor your feet," the headmaster continued, "but you will do the cleaning itself with your bare hands. Kwang, I will contact your father to tell him you will be staying late this evening." Mamoru. He looked for a long moment at his nephew and sighed. "I'll let your mother know when I get home." The shame in Mamoru's chest turned to physical pain. He had to clench his teeth to keep from blurting out, "Please don't tell her." He knew a real warrior wasn't supposed to concern himself with the opinions of women, but Mamoru couldn't help it. He dreaded his mother's disappointment more than any man's hard glare. She was a small woman with a sweet smile and a quiet voice, yet there was a knowing intelligence in her eyes that Mamoru had always found the smallest bit unsettling. There were times it felt as though she could see straight through him, to his beating heart and the flaws it sent pulsing through his veins. "Now go," the headmaster said, shaking back his sleeves and picking up his brush pen to continue his work. "Get yourselves cleaned up and don't be late for your next class." Both boys said a quiet, "Yes, sir," and bowed themselves out of the room. "What does he mean he'll tell your mom when he gets home?" Kwang asked as soon as they were out of earshot of the headmaster's office. "You live with the headmaster?" "Wait." Kwang's eyes went wide. "Is he your father?" Mamoru could only manage a miserable noise, putting a hand to his face. "Is he your father?" Kwang repeated. "Worse. He's my uncle." "Wow." Kwang laughed, surprisingly cheerful for a boy who had just been punched in the nose. "Is everyone in this town related?" Mamoru didn't answer. He just said stiffly, "Let's go to the washroom and clean off your face. You're getting your blood everywhere." "Technically, you got my blood everywhere," Kwang said, but followed Mamoru down the creaking hall toward the washroom. Was the headmaster serious about challenging people to single combat? "You guys really still do that? How else would we settle our differences?" "I don't know." Talking. Mamoru was tempted to point out that Kwang had actually thrown the first punch, but that would have sounded childish, so instead, he countered, "Maybe that's a luxury you have in the cities. Here, we keep ourselves and our convictions strong." While Kwang cleaned up, Mamoru paced the hall outside the washroom. There was no reason for him to stay, really. Kwang knew the way back from the washroom, and Mamoru would still have time for lunch if he hurried. But somehow, he couldn't get himself to walk away. He couldn't unseat the feeling that somehow things weren't finished here. As he listened to the slosh of water inside the washroom, Kwang cleaning the blood from his face, his own blood seemed to churn inside him. His fists clenched, and he felt his knuckles pulsing, an echo of his fist against Kwang's face. The rage echoed too, sending restless ripples through his nyama that he couldn't seem to calm. When Mamoru's temper got the best of him, his father liked to blame it on Ka-chan. Her clan were a wrathful, passionate lot, born of sea spray and crashing waves. Neither the most powerful nor the most skilled of Kaigen's warrior houses, the Tsusanos had made their name on the battlefield with their superhuman spirit and fury. It was said that the raw power of a true Tsusano was as changeable and devastating as a coastal storm. But Mamoru was not a Tsusano. He was a Matsuda. And Matsudas were not made of storms. They were ice cold in their calculations and unyielding in their integrity. He was not supposed to let his emotions whip his soul into storms. "You are ice," he reminded himself, rubbing his thumb back and forth over his knuckles as he tried to think of the unyielding Matsuda way to deal with Kwang. The mature warrior would obviously apologize for losing his temper. Like Uncle Takashi had said, that was no way for a warrior to behave. Then again, Uncle Takashi didn't know what Kwang had been saying before Mamoru laid him out on the courtyard floor. Kwang was a traitor to the Empire, or if not that, something dangerously close. If he was just fabricating lies to stir up conflict, Mamoru shouldn't bother apologizing. He should take the city boy straight to the arena and beat some respect into him. But if Kwang wasn't lying, Mamoru leaned back against a wall, feeling sick. His thoughts ran in dizzying circles. He was still trying to decide what to do when the door opened and Kwang emerged, dabbing blood from his upper lip. "Oh," Kwang said mildly. "You're still here." Mamoru inhaled and opened his mouth, hoping the right words would come to him. They didn't. So he dropped to his knees and put his hands on the floor before him. What are you doing?" Kwang said apprehensively. Mamoru bowed until his forehead touched his fingers. "Kwang-san," he started. I decline," Kwang said quickly. "What?" Mamoru lifted his head. "If you're challenging me to a duel, I decline, or I forfeit, or surrender, or whatever it is you people do. I saw you in sword class. I'm not going to fight you. You can't make me." "What?" "That's not what I'm doing," Mamoru said, putting his head to the floor again. "I wanted to say that I'm sorry. I should not have said those things to you. A warrior shouldn't lose his temper like that. It was wrong of me." "Was it?" Kwang said. "What?" "You're patriotic and loyal. You're exactly what everyone's told you to be." There was a note of condescension in Kwang's voice that made Mamoru's fingers tense, aching to curl into fists, but he was trying to demonstrate control, not to lose his temper all over again. When he couldn't think of anything to say, he pressed his forehead harder into his knuckles, worried that if he looked up at Kwang, he would punch him again. "Get up," Kwang sighed after a moment. When Mamoru didn't move a muscle, he added an impatient please. "I want to show you something." Reaching into the fold of his uniform, Kwang pulled out the smallest infocom device Mamoru had ever seen. The rectangular screen was barely bigger than his palm. "You brought that to school?" Mamoru said. He wasn't sure if having an infocom device was even allowed at Kimona, but he got the feeling it wasn't. "I bring it with me everywhere," Kwang said, tapping a command into the sleek glass device. "That's what us city kids do. Let me just see." He tapped around the screen, searching for something. "Here." He brought up the crispest holographic image Mamoru had ever seen, a tall obsidian statue in the middle of a sunny courtyard. "What is that?" Mamoru asked. "Near the Yamenka capital, there's this huge park filled with memorials in honor of the soldiers that died in pretty much every battle Yama ever fought. While my dad was doing work in Kalinjara, I had spare time to explore, and I found this memorial." The gleaming black glass formed the shape of a fighter jet, and beside it, a Yamenka pilot, a woman, with her helmet resting on her hip, her long braids pulled back and her chin lifted toward the sun. Mamoru had heard that the Yamenka Army and Air Force employed females, but there was something strange about seeing a curvy young woman in full military gear. She didn't look bad, Mamoru reflected, as he considered the obsidian pilot. She looked strong. But it was still strange. This statue, this whole part of the park, actually, is dedicated to Yamenkalu who lost their lives fighting in Kaigen. But no Yamankala died in Kaigen, Mamoru said in confusion. Hibiki-sensei was just telling us about that. The Empire drove the Ranganese back before the Yamanka reinforcements even arrived. Well, Kwang tapped a command into the infocom device, and the image zoomed in on white Yamanink lettering at the base of the statue. Bundanu Tananu Sera Ka. Mamoru started to sound out the inscription, but his Yamanink wasn't very good. Bundanu Tananu Sera Ka Dima Kaigenka Kelajanunuyi Kusanagi Gungil La to Hakilida, Kwang finished and translated for him. In memory of the warriors who gave their lives defending our Kaigenese allies on the Kusanagi Peninsula. The base of the memorial dripped with Phalea talismans, the kind family members handcrafted and hung on the graves of their loved ones. It was clear from the photo that real people had visited the site to mourn and remember, but how could that be? How could that be? Hibiki-sensei had said that no Yamankala died in Shirajima. Not one. I was surprised too, Kwang said. He seemed to be watching Mamoru's face carefully. I asked the Park Jasliwu about it, and they said that over 400 Yamanka soldiers died here. What? Most of them were air support. Yamanka jets weren't the best back then. Apparently, the Fonukala ripped them right out of the sky and crashed them into the Kaigenese troops on the ground. The school swayed, throwing Mamoru off balance, and he had to put a hand on the wall to stay on his feet. Dimly, he was aware that he couldn't just let Kwang stand there and say these things. He had to fight. A Matsuda always stood and fought, but Mamoru had never taken a hit from a foot, fist, or practice sword that left him this shaken. He felt sick deep in his stomach. I don't believe you, he said, even as the obsidian pilot stared back at him from Kwang's screen. That's not real. That can't be. It's not the only memorial. Kwang tapped his way to another image. This one honors over 2,000 Yamanka fighters who died helping the Kaigenese Empire defend Yongsan and push the Ranganese back to our current border. The thin mountain air had never bothered Mamoru. Why did he suddenly feel like there was no oxygen in his body? No. He was shaking his head. No. That can't be. That can't be right. Hibiki-sensei says, everyone knows, the Ranganese never reached Yongsan. That's ridiculous. I didn't want to believe it either, but the evidence is really solid. Our empire wouldn't have survived the Ranganese revolution without Yamanka aid. The Yamankala have no reason to lie about this. But they must be lying, Mamoru insisted. They must be. If this were all true, if all these Yamankala did fight here, why wouldn't we know about it? Why wouldn't Hibiki-sensei tell us? Has he ever been outside Kaigen? Kwang asked. I don't think so. It was very possible that Hibiki-sensei had never been outside the Shirajima province. But my grandfather fought in that battle. A lot of people's older relatives were there. Why wouldn't they talk about it? As he said the words, Mamoru realized that no one he had spoken to about the Kaliba had ever really elaborated. His grandfather, Susumu, when he had been alive, had only ever offered the vaguest of references to the war. It's possible the government ordered them not to, Kwang suggested. It happens. If the emperor is good at one thing, it's censorship. That doesn't make sense, Mamoru said, pushing through his inexplicable dizziness to get his thoughts in order. This is Kaigen. We're a warrior culture. The emperor and his officials would never disrespect thousands of fallen warriors by covering up their deaths. Kaigenese or not, those are soldiers who fought and died here. How could you think that Kaigen would show them such disrespect? Because Kaigen isn't a warrior culture, Kwang said impatiently. I know you think it is. I know you guys here in this village have these nice, wholesome, old-fashioned values, but have you ever been outside this province? No, Mamoru had to admit. Then you wouldn't know, Kwang said. You couldn't, but the rest of the empire hasn't held old warrior values for 100 years. The emperor doesn't care who lives and dies. He definitely doesn't care about fighting nobly. He cares that his empire stays intact under him. But Mamoru floundered. But that doesn't explain why the government would lie to us about the Kaliba. Sure, it does, Kwang said. You guys are the Sword of Kaigen. You're the buffer between Ranga and the rest of the empire's eastern islands. The emperor needs you to think you're invincible. And he needs the rest of the province to believe that the Kusanagi Peninsula can protect them from anything. Why? So you islanders won't leave. So you'll stay here and keep fishing the coasts and farming the land to fuel our dying economy. So you'll die protecting his lands, instead of moving into the overpopulated cities and getting disillusioned about the state of the empire like everyone else. No, no, no. Mamoru was shaking his head again. I don't believe you. He backed away from Kwang, but the northern boy's words had already seeped into his mind like poison. He had already seen the Yamanka statues. I don't believe you. Matsuda-san. Kwang reached out to him. It's okay. Don't touch me. Mamoru pushed Kwang back. Just stay away. To his horror, Mamoru realized that his impeccably steady hands had started trembling. Matsuda-san, I said stay away. Mamoru shoved Kwang so hard that he slammed into the washroom door. In a few staggering steps, he was running down the hall he didn't know where. Just away. Away from Kwang. You are a Matsuda, he tried to tell himself. You are solid ice, but his inner sea had turned to roiling brine. The floor shifted, pitching him into a wall. He stumbled to get his feet under him, but the whole world seemed to be spinning. It couldn't be true, but it couldn't be a lie, but it couldn't be true, and Mamoru couldn't seem to find his balance. Kwang's words had knocked the world off its axis. Aimless, Mamoru found himself staggering out onto one of Kimona's outdoor walkways. Wind stung his skin, scrambling his vision into a mess of blood-stained sand and careening fighter jets. He caught himself on the waist-high railing and found the mountains spinning beneath him, its mists, usually so familiar, suddenly gray and frightening. And for the first time in his 3 years at the swaying school, Mamoru threw up. Mamoru's stomach settled after he had emptied most of its contents down the mountainside. He didn't understand what had happened to him, and he decided it was best not to give it any more thought. No good could come of revisiting his own shameful weakness and Kwang's lies. It had been a mistake. All of it, the fight, the apology, that whole conversation with Kwang. No one had seen Mamoru retching his dignity over the railing. He could put it behind him. Gathering liquid water from the mist, he washed the acid out of his teeth, shook off the dizziness, and pretended it had never happened. None of it had happened. He made himself ice. Uncompromising. Immovable. And none of it could touch him. He didn't speak to Kwang during the second half of the day as they sat beside each other through the remainder of their classes. He didn't even look at him. Kwang, perhaps out of concern for his own safety, didn't press the issue, and Mamoru successfully pretended he didn't exist until classes finished. It wasn't until the two met after school to serve out their cleaning time that the two exchanged any words. What is that for? Kwang asked as Mamoru emerged from the closet with a coil of rope slung over his shoulder. It's for you, Mamoru said coldly, unless you want to walk around on the roof for a wadi with no safety harness. Oh. Without meeting the other boy's eyes, Mamoru tied one end of the rope around Kwang's waist. So, I'm, ugh. Kwang grunted as Mamoru yanked the knot tight. Ow, he said with a reproachful look at Mamoru. So, I'm supposed to trust you not to let me fall to my death? Mamoru glared. Don't be an idiot. If you fall, so do I. After securing the other end of the rope around his own waist, Mamoru hauled a ladder out of the closet and motioned Kwang to follow him to the nearest outdoor walkway. Mamoru didn't need a ladder to get onto the roof, but he was guessing the soft city boy wouldn't share his agility. The wind had calmed since their midday training. Good, Mamoru thought. Cleaning should go fast. Kwang was not looking so reassured. We're going to climb up there, he asked as Mamoru positioned the ladder against the edge of the roof. Yes. And, you're sure this isn't all some elaborate plan to have me killed for treason? The unsteadiness in Kwang's voice suggested that he was only partially joking, so Mamoru looked him straight in the eye. If I kill you, you'll be facing me with a sword in your hand. He nodded at the ladder. Climb. Of all the chores to be done at Kimona Academy, cleaning the roof was the most dangerous. For the most part, Takayubi's abundant rain kept the clay tiles clean, but with the runoff from further up the mountain soil, branches and dead leaves gathered in the curved parts of the roof. When the rooftop became visibly cluttered, Sure-footed students were sent up to clear it. Using sheets of water to wash the tiles, cleaning duty was the work of a few Seiranu, but Uncle Takashi had explicitly forbidden the two from using their Jia. Instead, Mamoru and Kwang would have to scoop up the layers of twigs and grime with their bare hands and throw it off the edge of the roof. The chore would have been hard enough work with a competent cleaning partner, but Kwang was afraid of heights. By the time he reached the top of the ladder and got onto the roof, he was shaking. "I can't," he stuttered on his hands and knees. "I can't do this." Mamoru felt a surge of vindictive satisfaction at seeing the casually arrogant city boy so terrified, but he crushed the feeling before it could swell beyond his control. "Your ice. He doesn't affect you." "Get up," he said. "I can't. I'm going to fall." "I said I wouldn't let you fall," Mamoru said. "I'm not a liar. Now stand up." "I can't," Kwang called back in frustration. "My leg muscles are all shot from your insane sword class." Mamoru could sympathize. He couldn't count the number of times he had worked his legs until they wouldn't hold him up anymore. It was how he had gotten his wrought steel muscles, but it was hard to feel sorry for someone while they were whinging and whining about a simple chore. "Just endure it," he said. "As soon as we're done, we can go home." "How do I stand up without falling?" Kwang asked. A fair question. While the roof wasn't dauntingly steep, the smooth clay tiles were slippery. Even a mountain-born Theonite like Mamoru couldn't walk across the surface safely, and with the exception of the decorative stone dragons snaking their way across the roof's broad beams, there were no handholds. "You have to pool water under your feet," Mamoru said, gathering mist and condensation into liquid beneath the soles of his own tabi. "Then freeze it so you don't slide. Like this." He waved a hand over his own feet, freezing the water into hard ice that anchored him to the steep roof tiles. "You can do that, can't you?" Kwang nodded shakily and started to gather water to the soles of his shoes. "Good," Mamoru said and turned away from Kwang, determined not to give the northern boy any more thought. Mamoru moved across the roof with careful ease, melting his ice whenever he needed to move and refreezing it when he found a new foothold. Had he been doing the job alone, he would have finished within a wadi. But he kept reaching the end of the rope and looking back to find Kwang far behind him, struggling to keep his balance on the steep surface as he collected tiny handfuls of dead leaves. A few times, Kwang let out a short cry and almost flailed off the edge roof in panic when Mamoru changed position. "What?" Mamoru snapped the third time it happened. Could you just tell me when you're going to move?" Kwang said, clearly fighting to keep his voice steady. "Just so I can be sure I'm secure?" "Fine," Mamoru said, his impatience starting to wear through his icy exterior. "But hurry up. If we don't finish in the next Babadi, we'll lose the light." The sun was already low in the sky, and trying to navigate the roof in the dark would be doubly dangerous. But despite all Mamoru's harsh words, Kwang didn't seem capable of working any faster. They still hadn't finished by the time the sun turned red and began to sink into the sea of mist. "This is impossible," Kwang complained for what felt like the 100th time. "Couldn't we just use our powers and be done with it?" "No," Mamoru said shortly. "Why not?" "The headmaster doesn't have to know." "He'll know," Mamoru said. "How?" "He's a Matsuda," Mamoru said. "He will know." "Just a tiny, undetectable bit of Jia?" Kwang pressed, "just to speed things along." "That would be dishonest," Mamoru said. Kwang made that little scoffing sound that Mamoru had come to hate over the past Wadanu. He meant to ignore it, but he found himself turning on the other boy, bristling. "Listen, I don't know how it works in all the fancy foreign places you've traveled, but here in Takayubi, we value honesty. We don't just make up ridiculous, self-serving lies whenever we feel like it." Kwang looked up at Mamoru with an unreadable expression, the lines of his face colored by the setting sun. Without the blood-red hue, he almost could have looked sad. "I have been honest with you, Matsuda-san." "You are ice," Mamoru reminded himself and returned Kwang's stare without emotion. "Just keep working." "Look, you have to understand, I'm not discussing this with you," Mamoru snapped. "I don't want to listen to disgusting lies, and neither does anyone else in this village. So, if you know what's good for you, you'll stop spouting them." Mamoru glared at Kwang, waiting for him, daring him to respond. Maybe the northern boy had run out of energy for argument, or maybe he was too scared of falling to anger the anchor at the other end of his rope. Whatever the reason, he didn't say anything in his defense. Mamoru couldn't say why, but that annoyed him more than anything. What's the matter? He wanted to demand. Nothing more to say now that the teachers aren't here to protect you? But he forced himself to let the anger go. With a wave of his hand, he melted his ice anchor to allow him to edge further down the roof. Wait, Kwang protested. I'm not ready. I don't care, Mamoru said and turned to reach for the uppermost beam of the temple roof. Move faster. Kwang, of course, chose that exact moment to lose his footing. It must have happened quite suddenly because his weight jerked against the rope so hard that Mamoru was ripped right off his feet. Mamoru might have been able to recover, but the fall smacked his head into the roof tiles. Stars exploded before his eyes, costing him precious moments. When he regained his bearings, it was just in time to feel his body tumble over the edge of the roof. His hands scrabbled for purchase, slid over the clay tiles, over the stone dragon's head adorning the corner of the roof, then caught on the dragon's snarling lower mandible. Kwang's weight yanked the rope tight, slamming into Mamoru's stomach like a practice sword to the gut. He grimaced as stone teeth dug into his fingers, but his grip held. On the other end of the rope, Kwang was flailing in panic. Oh, Falik, he gasped, his terrified voice echoing through the darkness below. Nanyare. We're going to die. Stop moving, Mamoru commanded. If Kwang could just make himself dead weight, Mamoru could pull them both to safety. But the two of them were dangling by fingertips, and every time Kwang squirmed, it got harder to hold on. Help! Kwang screamed. Somebody help. No one's here, Mamoru said. The last of the staff would all have gone home at least a body ago. Just calm down. I'm going to pull us back up. Mamoru had the strength in him to get them back onto the roof, but it was going to be a delicate operation. And if he tried to do it with Kwang thrashing around like an oversized fish at the end of a hook, they were both doomed. Though Mamoru's grip on the dragon head didn't falter, his grip on his temper did as Kwang continued to gibber in panic. I'm too young to die. I'm too young to die. Would you shut up? Mamoru snarled. We're not going to die. But as the words left his mouth, a horrible thought hit him. They were dangling from the easternmost corner of the roof, far from the steps and Kimono Lake. There was no water waiting to catch them, only jagged rocks. Kwang! Mamoru exclaimed, unable to suppress a note of panic. For the love of Nami, stop moving. If Mamoru had not been so busy shouting, he might have felt the telltale crack of breaking stone beneath his hands. Just don't let go, Kwang begged. I'm not going to let go, but if you don't stop moving, I will cut this rope and let you fall. Kwang uttered a terrified sound, but the threat had the desired effect. He stilled, allowing Mamoru to shift his fingers, finding a better grip between the dragon's teeth. Ignoring the whimpers of fear below him, Mamoru drew in a deep breath and started to pull up, his arms straining under the extra weight. He gathered water and froze it around the fingers of his right hand, just to make sure that it held when he reached out for the roof with his left. Satisfied that his grip would hold, Mamoru removed his left hand and reached, but it was not his iron grip that gave. The dragon's jaw broke off in his hand. No! Mamoru made a frantic grab for the edge of the roof, but it was too far. His fingertips slid off, and both boys plummeted into the mist. Chapter 4. The Warrior. I'm not dying here. The thought surged through Mamoru as he and his classmate plunged through open air down the mountainside. I am not dying here. Not because of a dinma of uncharacteristic clumsiness. Not because a lying outsider had made him lose his temper. With Matsuda's speed, Mamoru seized control of the mist around him, turned it to liquid, and slung a tendril of water upward to latch onto the nearest temple railing. As soon as the water made contact with the wooden stone, Mamoru started to freeze it, but he and Kwang were falling too fast. The tendril wasn't fully frozen when their weight jerked against it. The ice shattered and they kept falling, plummeting out of reach of the temple. Dimly, Mamoru realized that Kwang was screaming, but the sound was lost in the roar of the wind as he scrambled for a solution. Twisting his body over in the air, Mamoru found the rope and yanked on it, bringing Kwang in close, a decision he immediately regretted when the screams got closer too, nearly breaking his eardrums. But at least this way he could protect them both at once. Ignoring Kwang's shrieks of, "Oh gods! Oh gods!" Mamoru extended his jia to sweep the surrounding mist into his control. Holding onto Kwang by the back of his uniform, he threw all the water he could beneath them. If they were going to hit solid rock, the best he could do was minimize the impact. The darkness and vapor racing past on all sides made it impossible to see where they were falling, so Mamoru closed his eyes. He felt the break in the mist below, condensation-slick rock racing up to meet them terrifyingly fast, but he was faster. Pushing his jia into action, he just managed to turn his mass of mist and droplets to snow before he and Kwang hit the side of the mountain. The snow cushion tempered the collision, but the mountain still slammed hard into Mamoru's body, knocking the breath from his lungs. Tucking into a ball, he rolled with the fall, but they must have hit a steep slope because instead of rolling neatly onto his feet, he just kept tumbling. Rocks battered his spine, shoulders, and shins, his limbs tangled with Kwang's, and the two boys tumbled the last few bounds together before finally crashing into a solid outcropping that brought them to a stop. Mamoru uncurled onto his back, shaking with shock, his whole skeleton ringing with the echoes of rock against bone. Closing his eyes, he assessed the damage to his own body. Broken blood vessels pulsed beneath his skin, promising dark bruises. His back and knees were scraped and blood seeped from cuts on his forearms, but he was going to be all right. He was alive. "Kwang-san." He opened his eyes. "Are you okay?" The response was a muffled groan. The other boy was alive. That was enough for Mamoru to lie flat on his back for another few moments, getting his breathing under control. He didn't need his voice and limbs trembling when he rose. Once he had calmed his breathing and heart rate, he rolled over onto his hands and knees and took stock of their surroundings. They were perched on what seemed to be the only level place on an otherwise a steep incline. When Mamoru peered over the side of the ledge, he found sheer rock face stretching down into the darkness. "Is there any way down?" Kwang asked gingerly. Mamoru wasn't sure how to answer without causing more panic. It's not going to be easy. He wasn't even sure what part of the mountain they were on. Turning on the narrow ledge, he scanned the mountainside for something he recognized, but it was hard to see through the darkening fog, and nothing looked familiar. He could have used his jia to clear the mist, but he doubted it would do much good. There wasn't enough light left. "Are we going to die here?" Kwang asked. "No," Mamoru said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Worst case scenario, we'll have to wait for the morning light to find a way down, but we should try now, while there's still twilight." "Sorry," Kwang said. "I don't think that's going to be possible." "Kwang-san." Mamoru turned around in exasperation. "I know you're scared of heights, but oh no." The northern boy was crumpled against a nearby rock. His left forearm was bent the wrong way, broken. "Sorry." Mamoru went to Kwang, who appeared to be considerably more bruised than he was. "I should have done a better job breaking the fall." "I think you did okay," Kwang said, though his teeth were gritted against what must have been terrible pain, and he seemed afraid to move. "We're alive." "I've never seen someone materialize that much snow at once. I didn't know the fierce Kusanagi warriors could make such fluffy snow pillows." "Are you hurt anywhere else?" Mamoru asked. "Is there any bleeding?" "I don't think so," Kwang stammered. Sensing the distinct drip and flow of blood, Mamoru pulled back the leg of Kwang's hakama to reveal a deep gouge, where a jutting rock had taken a piece out of his calf. Blood was seeping freely from the injury, dripping down his shin to stain his silly Yamenka shoes. "Oh." Kwang squeaked like a girl. "What? How did you, Nyare? That looks terrible." "It could be worse," Mamoru said, "but we should stop the bleeding." Kwang reached down to clean the wound, his hands shaky and his jia even shakier. Mamoru pushed his hand away. "I'll do it. Hold still." With a wave of his hand, he pulled a sheet of water from the air and ran it over Kwang's leg, washing the blood away. Kwang jumped and sucked in a breath through his teeth, but managed not to squirm too much. "This is going to feel weird," Mamoru warned, putting a hand to the wound before more blood got a chance to seep out. Using his jia to hold the welling blood in place atop the wound, Mamoru began to draw the moisture from between the iron and carbon molecules, forcing the liquid to thicken and congeal. "What are you doing?" Kwang demanded, undoubtedly feeling the crawling, needle-like itch that always accompanied accelerated healing. "I'm creating a temporary scab," Mamoru replied. "Please hold still." Kwang gaped, his pain seemingly forgotten in his astonishment. "You can do that? You can control blood." Mamoru's jaw clenched, and he tried to focus more deeply on his work. "A bit. That's a rare ability." "Not in my mother's family," Mamoru answered without looking at Kwang. "She's at Susanoo." It was Ka-chan who had taught Mamoru how to create a makeshift scab. "For emergencies only," she had told him sternly. Blood manipulation is not a toy, nor is it something an upstanding Matsuda should display in public. Mamoru had always wondered about the extent of Ka-chan's abilities, but it would have been inappropriate to ask. Aunt Setsuko had once whispered that his mother could use the blood needle, a Susanoo bloodline technique wherein the Jijaka put a finger to their enemy's body and froze a drop of the victim's blood into a needle thin and sharp enough to pierce major blood vessels and lethal pressure points. Mamoru's jovial aunt could easily have been joking just to scare him. She liked to do that, and local lore had no shortage of horror stories about Susanoo blood manipulation. There were chilling tales of Susanoo Jijakalu so adept at controlling blood that they could manipulate the fluid in the bodies of other humans, using them as puppets. Unlike the Whispering Blade, Susanoo blood puppeteers were nothing more than a legend. No living Susanoo could attest to their existence, but it made for a good story to scare children. "That's amazing!" Kwang marveled as Mamoru withdrew his hands from the gash to reveal a thin red scab. "Don't touch it," Mamoru said sharply before Kwang got a chance to prod at his work. "It's no substitute for natural healing. It won't hold under stress. And, if you could, please don't mention this to anyone else." The ability was frowned upon within the Matsuda family. "Why not?" Kwang asked tactlessly. "It's not." Mamoru looked down. "It's not an ability that a Matsuda should have." According to Tusama, blood manipulation was the reason Mamoru couldn't master the Whispering Blade. When a true Matsuda drew water from his surroundings, it was pure. The master Matsuda formed his weapon by compressing several billion water molecules to a thin blade through sheer force of Nyama, creating ice as hard as metal and an edge the width of a single molecule. Mamoru always managed to catch other things up in his water, some iron particles, some dirt, some salt, some air bubbles, that weakened his ice and caused it to shatter under pressure. "Just don't tell the other boys at school." Kwang looked confused but agreed. "Okay, I won't." Sitting back on his knees, Mamoru looked Kwang over. The broken arm needed to be set properly before his Theonite body started to heal. The makeshift scab might not hold, and Kwang could have internal bruising that needed a healer's attention. Mamoru sighed. "This can't wait until morning," he decided. "The moon then?" "What?" "We'll wait until the moon is high. It's nearly full. It should cast enough light for us to climb down, or for me to carry you down the mountain." "We can't just call an ambulance?" Kwang asked. The question actually made Mamoru laugh aloud. "Takayubi doesn't have an ambulance. We don't even have a paved road." "Okay, but there must be a hospital, right?" Kwang said anxiously. "Where's the nearest hospital?" "The medicine monks live in the western village." "Not medicine monks." Kwang growled, his pain manifesting in irritation. "I mean a real hospital, with real medical equipment and vehicles and stuff." "Too far," Mamoru said, "near the amino stronghold on Tatsuyama." "Where the hell is that?" "At the base of the next mountain." Kwang let out a loud groan. "You know how many different schools I've gone to? Like 12. And you know what? This is the worst first day of school I've ever had. Ever." "You're going to be okay," Mamoru said. "I'm going to get us down." In his head, he tried to plot out their position on the mountain. They had fallen from the eastern side of the temple, meaning they had to be somewhere east of the lake. It wasn't a part of the mountain Mamoru had ever been before. There were no footpaths, and the steep rocks made climbing too risky for even a foolhardy adventurer. The slope they were perched on now was so steep that they probably would have gone right on rolling down the mountainside to their deaths if not for this bizarrely jutting rock formation, which, now that Mamoru was paying attention, did not feel much like rock at all. It was too perfect in its flatness. Too hard and glossy. What is this thing anyway? Kwang gave voice to Mamoru's thoughts. Kwang, who had fallen with his whole body against the smooth surface, pushed himself up with his good arm and ran a hand over the strange formation. Standing, Mamoru stepped back as far as the ledge would allow and surveyed the shape. It was darker than the rest of the mountainside, like a deep shadow behind Kwang. A flattened piece protruded from the body of the shadow, like a fin or a wing. "It's a plane!" Kwang exclaimed, just as the same realization dawned on Mamoru, and a smile lit his face. "Oh." Mamoru clapped his hands together as the pieces slid together on his mental map. "I know where we are." "What?" "This is the Black Plain wreck," he explained. "It's been here forever. You can see it from the lower steps when you look across the lake, which means we must be close to the water." Relief coursed through Mamoru. The climb would be manageable after all. Oh, Kwang looked from Mamoru to the plain halfway buried in the mountainside. "So, this has been here for a long time?" "Yeah." Mamoru remembered the first clear morning Yuta had pointed it out, a smudge of dark metal lodged in the slope on the far side of the lake. It was here before Kimona became a school. His father and uncle had mentioned seeing the plane when they climbed the steps as boys. "Wait, so, how did it get here?" Kwang asked, squinting in confusion. "It crashed during a military exercise, back when the Empire had troops in training here." That was what Hibiki-sensei had told Yuta when he asked. The government was testing out some unmanned stealth aircraft. There was some kind of malfunction with this one. Its engines failed, so they steered it into an uninhabited part of the mountain to crash. "Really?" Kwang reached out to touch the plane with the fingers of his good hand, his brow furrowed. "So that would have been when?" "During the Kaliba." The Great War had been the last time the government maintained any military presence in Shirajima. Kwang was running his hand in slow circles over the body of the plane, as though searching it for something. "Matsuda-san." His voice had grown quiet and strained. "I don't know how to tell you this. This isn't a Kaigenese plane." "What?" Mamoru let out an incredulous laugh, even as dread pulled at something weak inside him. "Of course it is. Where else could it have come from?" Kwang shook his head, looking apologetic, almost afraid. "It's Yamenka." "Why would you say that?" "Damn Kwang." Mamoru couldn't keep the anger out of his voice. "Why would you say that?" Now Kwang was definitely afraid, but that didn't stop him from explaining. "Kaigenese planes are made of metal." "This isn't metal." "Don't be ridiculous." Mamoru crossed to the plane in 2 angry strides. "Of course, it's made of." But when his fingers touched the body of the plane, the words stopped in his throat. "No metal was that smooth." What is this?" "Silicon glass," Kwang said. "What?" "Silicon glass," Kwang repeated. "The hardest type of Yamenka obsidian. It's the strongest material in the world." "You're not a craftsman," Mamoru snapped in desperation. "How could you possibly know that?" "Just look." Kwang put a hand against the plane and painstakingly stood to point to where its nose had rammed into the mountain. "This jet crashed here and didn't break. It went straight into the side of the mountain and there isn't one crack in it." And now that Mamoru looked, Kwang was right. The plane's exterior couldn't have been smoother if it were manufactured yesterday. Even the purest Kotetsu steel didn't have that kind of durability. Only silicon glass could do that. Mamoru's fingers curled against the shell of the plane. "No," he breathed. "You're lying. This wasn't a Yamenka plane. It wasn't silicon glass. You're lying." He would prove it. Mamoru dug his hands into the side of the plane until he felt his fingernails threatening to break, then dragged them down, trying to scratch the allegedly impervious glass. But even as Mamoru's nails bent and broke, he couldn't leave the tiniest mark on the plane. The surface was so perfect that in the weakening twilight, Mamoru could see his own face reflected in the blackness. Troubled. Frantic. The face of a lost child, not a warrior. "I'm not lying," Kwang said quietly. "You could take all the swords in Kaigen to that glass and you wouldn't be able to scratch it." Shut up. Mamoru snarled, hating the fear in his voice. He would make Kwang shut up, like he had back in the schoolyard. He would break through this black glass and prove him a liar, and this would all be over. Mamoru drew an arm back and punched the side of the plane with all his strength. A spear of pain slammed through his arm, but he didn't let that stop him. He struck again and again, in a rain of blows that would have dented any metal. Mamoru's hands could break rock and steel, but the only things that broke now were the skin and blood vessels on his knuckles. Matsuda-san, stop. Stop. Kwang begged, though he didn't seem willing to put himself in range of those fists a second time. You'll break your hand. I'm telling you, that's the hardest glass in the know, Mamoru growled through gritted teeth. No, it's not. Drawing his fist back, he froze blood and missed into the hardest ice he could form across his knuckles and punched again. The ice broke, sending a shockwave of pain through his hand. The plane's shining black exterior was not even scratched. But Mamoru was shattered. A wadi earlier, Kwang's assertions had been just words and a few holographic images. Those could be faked and made up. Now a piece of his story was right in front of Mamoru. It was Zillazin glass, harder than his own ice. Unbreakable. Irrefutable. Matsuda-san. Kwang's voice would have sounded gentle if the words weren't twisting into Mamoru like knives. Just look at it for a dinma. Have you ever seen a Kaigenese jet this shape? Mamoru wished he couldn't hear the words, tried not to hear them, but the plane was right in front of him. And Kwang was right, it looked nothing like any jet he had ever seen thunder overhead, nor any plane in the Kaigenese military parades on TV. It took him a moment to realize where he had seen this type of jet before, in the form of an obsidian memorial statue, with a proud woman pilot beside it. A pilot. In a desperate lurch, Mamoru was scrambling up onto the tilted wing of the plane. What are you doing? Kwang demanded, trying and failing to hold the stronger boy back with his one good arm. Be careful, Matsuda-san. You don't know how stable that is. Hibiki-sensei had said that the black plane was part of Kaigenese forays into unmanned jets during the Kaliba. Mamoru could confirm that it was the truth. If he climbed onto the top of the plane and there was no pilot seat, he could ignore everything Kwang had said. He could lay this all to rest. He could. The hope died as he reached the top of the plane and found a raised cockpit before him. While the body of the plane was as black as cold coals, the cockpit was made of transparent glass, so clear it could have been polished the day before. Mamoru should have stopped there. He should not have crawled forward to peer through the glass. But he looked, and his whole body stiffened. The blood fled his cheeks, leaving him as pale as the face before him, if one could call it a face. All that remained of the pilot was a skull, lying askew atop a jumble of white bones. The shreds of fabric clinging to the warrior's ribcage were too deteriorated to identify as any kind of military uniform. The skin, whether it had been pale or dark, had decayed from the bones a long time ago. Mamoru's first impulse should have been to start back from the human remains, but he was frozen, trapped in the emptiness of those sockets where once there had been a pilot's sharp eyes. Matsuda-san? What is it? Kwang made as though to climb up to look into the cockpit too, but Mamoru shook his head. The look on his face must have said everything because Kwang stopped. Is it bad? He asked quietly. Just, don't look, Mamoru said, though he himself couldn't take his eyes off the skeleton. Don't look. Pilots were young people with keen eyesight and quick reflexes, skilled enough to maneuver a machine many times the speed of a human, brave enough to battle far above sea or solid ground. And this young fighter had been left to rot here with no grave, no memorial, no one to remember them. Until wind and rain had washed away their face, their skin, their uniform, any indicator of who they were and what they fought for. Mamoru looked into the sockets and wondered if the pilot had had black eyes like his. Would his face look the same stripped of all its skin? Would the mountain wash him away as easily? He put his hand to the cockpit glass and let his fingers trail down until they ran over a series of fine grooves in the glass. Turning his attention to the shapes beneath his fingertips, Mamoru saw that the cockpit was lined with Phalea symbols of strength and protection. Among the symbols, in Yamanink letters, was an inscription. N. Nyama Dugula, Mamoru read out slowly. Nyama Jiena La. He turned to Kwang, unable to keep his voice from shaking. What does it mean? Nyama Dugula Nyama Ganala? Kwang repeated the words with the musical ease of a native speaker. My Nyama for my country. My Nyama for my king. The strength went out of Mamoru's limbs. Involuntarily, he found himself crumpling in something like a bow, something like pain. His forehead thudded against the cockpit. It had been decades since this plane hit the mountainside, yet Mamoru could feel it crashing through everything he knew, scattering the broken pieces to the elements. It didn't seem to matter whether the skeleton belonged to a man or a woman, a Kaigenese pilot or a Yamenko one. A warrior had died here, and Hibiki-sensei had lied about it. The whole village had lied about it. Mamoru's Nyama seethed with something different from anger, different from hurt. It was utter disorientation. The force of his world falling apart churned the mist. Condensation writhed and slithered over the rocks. Matsuda, Kwang said as the blood rose from his skin, pulled into the whirl of Mamoru's Jia. He looked on nervously until Mamoru's turmoil tugged at the blood inside his open wounds. Ow! Hey! The shout of pain was enough to yank Mamoru out of his confusion. His head jerked up. A sharp gasp brought the mountainside back into focus. With a few measured breaths, he managed to bring his Jia under control. He was far from stable ice, but he managed to release the water particles around him, including those in Kwang's blood. Ow! Kwang repeated, looking on in a mixture of wonder and horror as his own blood settled back onto his skin in a sticky mess. The wound in his calf was bleeding again, worse than before. Sorry, Mamoru breathed, shaking his head. I'm sorry. Here, I'll fix it. Jerkily, he climbed down from the plane and folded to his knees to tend to Kwang's leg. He tried to find solace in his own Jia, repairing the broken scab. But his control had fled him, his power scattering out of his grasp. Ow! Kwang pulled his leg back as Mamoru's third attempt to repair the scab only made the bleeding worse. Sorry, Mamoru repeated in a weak voice that didn't seem to belong to him. I'm sorry. It's okay, Kwang said, though he had put a hand over the wound, silently refusing Mamoru's help. I'll just cut off part of my sleeve and tie it. Mamoru nodded and tried to laugh it off. I guess I'm not as good with blood as I thought. That's fine with me. Kwang gave Mamoru a strained smile. I don't want to wake up one day to find you using me as a puppet. That's not, Mamoru shook his head, barely able to focus on Kwang's words. Blood puppeteering isn't real. It's just a myth. Well, I thought all the rumors about the Shirajima warriors were just myths, but you island people are more powerful than I thought. Kwang pressed his lips together and stared at Mamoru with a strange expression, something guilty and pitying that made Mamoru want to retch. Maybe there is some truth to what your history teacher told you. Maybe don't, Mamoru whispered. What? Just don't. His voice was strained. Don't speak to me. He was one slip-up away from losing his tenuous grip on his Jia all over again. Stiffly, he turned away from Kwang and the cursed glass plane. I'm going to meditate. It was the only thing he could think of to do. The sheer exhaustion helped. Often Mamoru could meditate better when he was drained, near sleep, when the whole world melted away except for the water all around him. Mamoru focused until Kwang disappeared. The plane and its pilot disappeared. The rock disappeared. The only thing left in the world was pure water, clear as daylight and clean as polished steel. Deep in his trance, Mamoru could feel the outline of the mountain, coated in a sheen of water droplets. He followed the mist and condensation, sinking and trickling gently downward until he could feel the heavy ripple of liquid water, the Kimono Lake. Its weight eased a slow breath from Mamoru's body, relaxing his muscles. He settled into the embrace of the lake and nestled there for a long time, swirling with the spring water. Then, when it was time, gravity drew him to the biggest of the lake's outgoing streams, and he slipped into it. The stream carried him down the mountain, through the dewy grasses of the western village, until it splayed its fingers over the rocks around the Finawa's temple, becoming many streams, all flowing down, until they met the salty weight of the ocean. The primordial power that had given birth to Kaigen, humanity, and life itself. Here, Even things as fleeting as mountain streams became part of eternity. Here, there was a truth that ebbed and shifted but never died. Here, he was home. Rooted in the depths, he felt the moon rise. Drawn to the irresistible lure of Nami's mirror, he rose too, lifting fishing boats at their moorings. Tide pools filled up all the way down the coast, silver as dragon scales under the full moon, little mirrors to answer her brightness. He opened his eyes to the sight he knew he would find, Nami's mirror held high in the sky, shining with pure light that pierced the realms of past and present. Breathing out, he was Mamoru again, but more whole. The tide pools are full, he said without emotion. It's time. What? Kwang started upright from where he had been dozing against the side of the plane. Time for what? Mamoru nodded toward the sky. That's all the moonlight we're going to get. Don't worry. We don't have far to go. Far to where? Kwang mumbled, still half asleep. The Kimono Lake. It's about 10 bounds below us. Are you sure? Kwang asked. 10 bounds is a long way to sense clearly. Still attuned to the water all around him, Mamoru couldn't help a human smile of amusement. Not for me. Fine. But I swear to Nyare, if there are more rocks down there, and we jump, my ghost is going to haunt your ghost to the end of the Laxara. We're not going to jump. Mamoru wouldn't admit it, but he didn't think he had the nerve for any more free-falling through the darkness, no matter how clearly he could sense the water below. You're going to get on my back, and I'm going to climb down. I don't know if I can hold on with just one arm. Good thing we have a rope. Mamoru had never tried scaling a sheer cliff face, but his mother had once told him that it was easy to climb smooth walls with only ice if your jia was strong and you coordinated it right with your physical movements. How a housewife like Ka-chan knew how to scale walls, Mamoru had no idea, but she turned out to be right. Recalling her instructions, he formed a disc of water around each hand and then turned the water to ice, freezing his hands to the rock. To descend, all he had to do was melt the ice beneath one hand enough to shift it down, refreeze it, and then repeat the process with the opposite hand. A weaker Jijaka might risk the ice breaking from the flat surface, but Mamoru's jia was easily strong enough to secure him to the mountain, even with a nervous Kwang tied to his back. Hand under hand, he lowered himself and his classmate down the cliffside. The mist grew thicker as they neared the lake, coiling tendrils reaching from the water's surface to wrap around them, smothering the moonlight. Visibility grew steadily worse as they descended, and Mamoru had to rely on his jia to feel his way down the last few bounds to the water. Okay, so what's your plan now? Kwang asked as he too sensed the lake beneath them. I don't know if I can swim that far with one arm. You won't have to. Mamoru was already at work, freezing the lake water directly beneath them, forming a broad shape. When he lowered them to the lake, their feet touched the bottom of a boat made of sturdy, buoyant ice. Oh, Kwang said in surprise and looked appreciatively at the sleek vessel. Well done, Matsuda-san. It would take me a whole body to form a boat this nice. Sit, Mamoru said, lowering himself to his knees. The boat wasn't perfectly balanced. It would capsize if either of them stood and moved around too much. Okay. Kwang gingerly arranged his damaged body into a sitting position opposite Mamoru. Do you need me to help propel or no? Mamoru said, and with a sweep of his hand, sent them gliding swiftly over the lake's surface. You don't know where we're going. People whispered that the moonlit curls of mist on the lake were ghosts from the next world, striding their silvery way over the water's surface. Mamoru had never feared them. The people who had lived and died here in times past were Matsudas and Yukinos. They were family. Tonight, for the first time, they seemed like strangers. This was the first time he had had to look at the wisps of the past and wonder what they were really. Were they the ancestors he had always imagined, or something entirely different? Had they fought in battles the rest of the world had covered up and forgotten? Had their lifeblood stained these waters before it was washed to the sea? If so, they must resent the living for washing away the memory of their sacrifice as easily as blood from a shoreline. The Ryuhan monks said that spirits only ever remained bound to the realm of the Duna unwillingly, trapped there by bitterness, regret, or simple spite. Was there anger in the silvery tendrils crowding around Mamoru? Did they resent him for his ignorance? Were they offended that he did not know the extent of their sacrifice? Or was it his treasonous thoughts that had turned them sinister? Maybe somehow Kwang had really tricked him. A liar had made him doubt his family, his empire, and everything he had been taught. Now his ancestors, stung with the insult, had come seething out of the Laksara to drag him away. Shadows wavered through the fog, and Mamoru found himself pressing closer to Kwang. "What is it?" the other boy asked, oblivious to the otherworldly presences. "Nothing." Mamoru raised a hand, dispersing the mist before the keel, pushing aside any ghostly faces waiting in the darkness ahead. "It's nothing." Mamoru managed to keep himself calm across the remainder of the lake, but he still let out a breath of relief when their vessel bumped the shore and the two stepped out onto solid ground. His shoulders tense, Mamoru realized he was too afraid to turn and look back at the lake. "Are you sure you're okay?" Kwang asked, peering at Mamoru's face in the low light. "Of course I'm okay," Mamoru said, doing his best to adopt an icy tone. "You're the one with a broken limb. Come on." He took hold of Kwang's uninjured arm with both hands. "Stay close. I know the path here, but it's steep and uneven. I don't want you to fall and break any more bones." It was a plausible excuse, but at that moment, it was Mamoru who really needed a living thing to hold on to.